After World War II, American foreign policy became ensnarled in what we called the Cold War. So let's look now at how the Cold War developed, particularly in its early years. We have to talk about the Cold War as lasting from approximately 1947. You can back that up a little bit to 46 maybe, until 1991, but I would extend it to approximately 1995. There are some definite touchstones in there, but unlike hot wars, the Cold War just kind of faded in and faded away. So there's no real lines of demarcation, at least not this close to the event itself. I think historians are probably going to agree later on a periodization for the Cold War, but right now we're too close to the events as they unfolded for us to have enough perspective to really see good periodization. Well, so what is the Cold War? The Cold War, was a struggle between the U.S.-led world and the Soviet-led world. A colloquialism to describe the European manifestation of Russian Soviet control was coined by Bernard Baruch. The Cold War itself was coined by Bernard Baruch, and that epithet, Iron Curtain, was coined by Winston Churchill in 1946 in a speech in Missouri in which he said, "An iron curtain has descended over Eastern Europe." We'll talk about that in just a second. The Cold War was diplomacy mixed with war, like Clausewitz said in the early 1800s, war is diplomacy by other means. Within the framework of the UN, the Cold War was an alternative to full-on nuclear war, and we see it manifest itself in alliances based on spheres of influence and on proxy wars. That is, little fights between one of the major powers and a minor power that fronts for the other major powers, or in two sides in a minor area fighting against one another, one backed by one side, one backed by the other. The responsibility for the Cold War and its origins are hotly debated topics among historians. The orthodox view that arose in the U.S. pretty soon after the Cold War began and lasted throughout pretty much the entirety of the Cold War, at least into the 1970s, was that paranoid Soviet leaders, particularly Stalin, tried to dominate the globe and so caused the Cold War. But the revisionist view, which has been coming out since about 1972 to 75, is that the U.S. leading a capitalist world tried to exchange colonial dominance for economic dominance of the globe and refused to secure the borders of the USSR and its access to warm water ports. There are variations on these themes, and again, they are hotly debated among historians, and no consensus has yet developed as to what is the most likely explanation for the beginning of the Cold War. However, we can look at a lot of its manifestations. In the early years of the Cold War, the United States and its Western allies always believed that the most significant problems were going to occur in Europe. They really didn't look at any other part of the world, though by 1950, we as historians can look back and say, well, it appears that we began entering into a global Cold War in about 1950. So it's only been it was only a couple of years, potentially 3 or 4, that we thought the Cold War was just going to take place in Europe, a battle, hot or cold, a fear of war between former allies taking place through Eastern Europe in a battle for domination of Europe. And then after 1950, though, we see that this becomes globalized. And that's something we're going to talk about in this lecture. The problem in Europe was the post-war territorial settlements. As you see from the inset of this map, Berlin itself was divided into 4 occupation zones. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones until 1955, when the 3 zones to the west of East Germany joined together to form West Germany. Germany has, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, become a unified nation. The old 4 occupation zones were unified together, and it was tough. It was hard to do. As you see from the map here, the countries of Eastern Europe became satellites of the Soviet Union. The pink countries you see here are members of the Warsaw Pact. The yellow countries are non-aligned, and the green countries are NATO countries. And this pretty much follows the standoff between the Soviet and government and its satellites and Western governments who the European governments were not satellites of the U.S., but they were very, very closely aligned with the governments of the U.S. From the Soviet point of view, the Western European governments were very much satellites of the U.S., just like we consider these other governments to be, the Eastern European governments to be satellites of the Soviet Union. We need to talk now about the players. We have 2 U.S. presidents and 2 long-time and long-term rulers of their respective countries standing off against each other in the early years of the Cold War. Harry S. Truman to the far left and Dwight D. Eisenhower to the far right, U.S. presidents from 1945 until 1961. Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union was premier of the Soviet Union, general secretary of the Communist Party, which made him the leading figure in the Soviet Union from the mid-1920s until he died in 1953, replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. And then Mao Zedong, the successful prosecutor of the war in China, the civil war in China, revolution, I guess, that overthrew the nationalist Chinese government, running them off to Taiwan in 1949 and becoming himself the dictator of China into the late 1960s. Okay, so these are the players. Early in the history of the Cold War, then the U.S. response to its perception that the Soviet Union, and we're not talking about China yet, but that the Soviet Union wanted to expand into Western Europe. That was containment. Our policy was containment. Some in the U.S. feared that Roosevelt and Truman had been and were soft on communism, soft on the USSR, but a speech by Stalin in February of 1946 to the Politburo, the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, hardened Harry Truman's attitude toward the Soviets and hardened it noticeably. He decided he would have to take some kind of action because he feared, because of this secret speech by Stalin that he found out about, that the Soviets wanted to take over the world. That's how Truman and company interpreted Stalin's remarks. And it's easy to see why they would do so in that period of time. Stalin, on the other hand, was too blustery. He was making an internal speech, thumping his chest, was not really meant for external consumption. And I think that Truman and company may have overreacted. But at the time, there was no way, given their mindset, for them to know what would actually have occurred. And they can't be that wrong. So they have to make very conservative estimates that the Soviets are more aggressive than they actually are, and that the West has to be prepared. So in response to this, particularly this speech, and in response to what he was seeing already, the charge d'affaires in Moscow, we did not have an ambassador. The charge d'affaires is the senior diplomat representing the interests of the U.S., but is not an official ambassador. This guy name was George Kennan, and you see him pictured here. He just recently died. He was over 100 years old when he died, just within the last few years. He wrote a long memo in the form of a telegram, 30, 40 page single-spaced telegram called the Long Telegram, interestingly enough. And he later wrote an article in the influential academic / policy journal Foreign Policy, signed by Mr. X, which was just an elongation of his long telegram. What he proposed was that the Soviets would, quote, fill all nooks and crannies in the basin of world power. He said that they would find power vacuums and fill them. So if a country was in turmoil, then you could expect that the local Communist Party would get the backing of the Soviets, and then they would try to secure that country either electorally or revolutionarily for the Soviet sphere. The Soviets, said Kennan, would be cautious because they did not want an atomic war, but at the same time, the only thing that they would respond to is a firm hand, and that they understood only power. However, he proposed a system called containment, that using military and diplomatic in particular, and economic in particular, and political in particular power, then the Soviets could be contained in the sphere that they already enjoyed. Let's look back at the map. The Soviets could be contained in Eastern Europe and would not move out of Eastern Europe. So Kennan proposes that the Soviets be blocked by the U.S. and its allies through a concerted diplomatic, economic, political, and military presence. So we can see through policy at the U.S. and through foreign affairs at the U.S. how the Truman administration tried to implement containment. And we see it in the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and collective security. So let's talk about all of these right now. The Truman Doctrine sprang up in 1947 because the U.S. feared that the Soviets were trying to expand into the Mediterranean and the Middle East by exploiting discontent that bordered on civil wars in both Turkey and Greece. The Greek government was under attack by communist-inspired rebels, The U.S. interpreted communist-inspired rebels as being paid lackeys of the Soviet Union, and the USSR was putting a lot of pressure on Turkey and supporting its Communist Party as well. So the Truman Doctrine was kind of a stick, a threat, that the U.S. vowed it would arm any government that was threatened by a communist insurgency or by outside communist aggression. That took care of Greece and Turkey, but it also put us on a road to global engagement against what we consider to be communist expansion. The U.S. would arm any government that was threatened by a communist insurgency or by communist outside aggression. This Truman Doctrine and our assistance to Greece and Turkey that came in immediately afterwards then had the U.S. replace Great Britain as the policeman of the Middle East. We'll talk about that in a later lecture. A carrot to Europe was the Marshall Plan. So the Truman Doctrine is a stick. A carrot is the Marshall Plan. This was called the official name was the European Recovery Program, and it was named for the Secretary of State, former General George Marshall. It was a pumping of money into Western Europe, into the states of Western Europe, and it was offered to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but they refused it. And between 1948 and 1951, it provided $13 billion to rebuild European infrastructure and to abate poverty. Now, here's the kicker on that. There was no real economy able to provide the kind of services and goods needed by Western European governments. For example, Germany had been bombed basically flat, and rubble removal required not just a bunch of people out with picks and shovels, but it required heavy moving equipment. And the only country that could provide significant quantities of caterpillars and front-end loaders and backhoes and cranes and trucks and things to move the rubble was the United States. So as the Marshall Plan pumped $13 billion into European economies, most of that money was spent buying U.S. products. So everybody wins. And we pay our money to somebody else to pay us back. So it's a pretty interesting phenomenon. And it really did stabilize many of these governments. When poverty is rampant, when people are distraught, then revolutionary governments or revolutionary movements can take hold. And we always considered communism to be a revolutionary movement. Another of the, I guess this is both a carrot and a stick. It was a stick to the Soviet Union, but a carrot to Berlin is the Berlin airlift of 1948, another manifestation of containment in action. At the London conference that ran from February through June of 1948, Western nations proposed reunifying the four occupation zones of Germany as a single powerful nation. To prevent this, the USSR closed off West Berlin. That is, West Berlin was buried deep in the center, let's see the map again, deep in the center of East Germany. Here's Berlin right there, deep in the center of East Germany. And so the Soviets closed off access by truck to Berlin in an effort to starve Berlin so that the West would back away from unifying the country or even unifying their own occupation zones. So Truman, who really did not respond well to that kind of blackmail, then instructed the Air Corps, the Air Force, I guess by 1948, to airlift tons of food per day for 15 months between June of 1948 and September of 1949, when the Soviet Union gave in and reopened access and gave up on, and they got a few concessions, and they stalled the reunification of the occupation zones in the West until 1955, but they did not win outright. We did not win outright, but we did show the Soviets that we would not be intimidated or bullied by blackmail. That is us being the West, the non-communist nations of the West. Another manifestation, and the last we want to talk about now, is collective security agreements, which replaced the old secret treaty alliances, at least in the era that we call pactomania. The first of these, and the most important, and the one still with us today in obvious form, even though it's searching for a new mission, was formed in 1949, and it is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was a collective security agreement between the nations of Western Europe and the United States that by 1950 began to integrate the defense forces of these nations and to create a collective military presence, because we really thought, we being Western Europe and the U.S., really thought that the Soviets were going to pour over the Polish border with jillions of tanks and just run roughshod over over Western Europe. And so this collective security agreement was designed to either prevent that or forestall it, or to at least let the Soviets know that it wouldn't be a free ride coming in. Well, the Soviet response was to create its own collective security agreement, the Warsaw Pact of 1955. And that is the Soviet collective security agreement with all of these, and again, I'll show you this map, with all of these countries in pink in Eastern Europe: East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, even. Now, Yugoslavia was communist, but it was not aligned with the Soviet Union. It took its own course under Tito. The U.S. liked these arrangements so much, these pacts, collective security agreements so much, that we entered in the 1950s and early 60s into NATO-type collective security agreements across the world. And so historians have taken to calling this era pactomania in American foreign policy. We have the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization in 1954 that was centered in Australia. We have the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, in 1959 that included Turkey. And eventually, and we have a bunch of others, so that eventually the U.S. found itself obliged to protect 43 other nations. And this has not really abated very much. Some of these pacts have gone by the wayside as their missions have been not neglected, but have changed, and so they're no longer needed. But we still find ourselves, based on a lot of these collective security agreements, obliged to come to the aid and defense of double digits of other nations. Okay, so the early Cold War developed sometime after 1946-47. The term was coined by Bernard Baruch. Iron Curtain term, which you may have heard, is coined by Churchill. The Cold War was both an alternative to nuclear war played out in the political field of the United Nations and by proxy hot wars. We thought it was going to start in Europe, and we attempted to contain Soviet expansion in Europe based on the ideas of George Kennan, our charge d'affaires in Moscow. This era was called Containment. and we did it with the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. We demonstrated our resolve and our mechanism of resolve by the Berlin Airlift, and we created collective security agreements. And with that, we conclude this lecture, and I thank you very much.